good trouble. And
That's
good trouble
glad.
is certainly alive among us. I mean, I'll just name two examples. I mean, we got Kathleen through every day what she does with peace, Andrea every day what she does with voting, and so much more among us. That is truly good trouble. And, I remember the different times in my life where it was lifted up that God is taking what is going on inside us and lifting it up. And one of those times was in seminary in Baltimore, there at the Catholic seminary that I went to, and there was a psalm that was lifted up by one of my instructors that was celebrating God and anger. I thought, oh, yeah, I can be angry and a person of faith. Yay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, all right. Our prayer of invocation, Terry. So, this was an introduction to peace that we heard at that gathering that George Terry and I were at. Hey, Terry, why don't you read this?
Being at peace is the heart of Buddhism. When I think about what I'm trying to do in meditation, I'm trying to view everything that arises as the Buddha, that nothing ever needs to be pushed away or grasped after. In my daily life, I am trying to bring a peaceful heart to whatever I experience without qualification.
That was the introduction, and now uh, there should be a prayer. So, Terry, why don't you continue?
Evoking the presence of great compassion, let us fill our hearts with our own compassion towards yourselves and towards all living beings. Repay that all living beings realize that they are all brothers and sisters, all nourished from the same source of life. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Catherine, could you lead us in the Psalm of Lament?
Psalm 13, a psalm of lament. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for God has been good to me.
Catherine, thank you for your emails this week. I have been so busy, and forgive me for that I haven't responded, but I will. I appreciate you. Okay.
Thank you.
Who can lead us through the cycle? Hey, Kathleen, how about you lead us through the prayer for transformation, new life cycle?
Holy God, too often we seem determined to turn away from you. You, however, continually call us to repentance, to turn back to you and your way. We pray for fortitude to remain on the path set by Jesus and embody the ministry of Christ in the world. Deliver us from the insignificant concerns that distract us and empower us to do the work you have called us to do. Most of all, grant us grace to be the people you have made us to be. Beloved, you have received an inheritance of riches in God. These treasures of hope, strength, encouragement, peace, grace, joy, rest, and love are yours to claim. They are yours to live. Receive them freely and abundantly.
Thank you. Great.
Good.
We sang that song at the revival service this week. Like a tree planted by the water.
Yeah.
That's us. We shall not be moved.
Did you notice that one person in the crowd they zoomed in on? He's rather famous.
Help me out. I missed that.
Peter Fonda.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. So if you're enjoying our service today, and we pray that you are, and if you're not on Zoom with us here, know that you could be. And also, yes, consider a donation to our church. As you can tell, we don't have a building. No one here is on salary, but still, yeah, we have some bills. We're all volunteers, so 80% or more of our donations will go to good causes and people that are in need of our help. You can make a one-time donation or a reoccurring one. We appreciate you. Come again. Okay. Now, this is our pastoral prayer time. We have our individual prayer time after Michael's message this morning. But this is our more, I guess you could say, global prayer time. And so, because we know the issues that we face today are indeed major. So let us pray.
Yeah.
Oh God, we think back to Old Testament times and New Testament times and how the Bible describes those challenges that countries and civilizations and towns, temples, and all were facing. And then this person, Jesus, came along, and he didn't want there just to be one religion. He didn't even intend to start a religion. Michael will share with us this morning. Jesus came as, well, King of, we'll find out. We look forward to the message this morning because Jesus was indeed just simply opening up and welcoming everyone. When he turned over the tables, he meant that good troublemaking was a part of his creator. You are God. And so we're grateful for that image of good troublemaking that comes down from the time of Jesus. and that we understand that as a key to our faith. And so we have come together as Tree of Life, a seed planted by the water, and in the spirit of good troublemaking, we shall not be moved. We will not be moved, O God, because that's what you call us to do. As we heard, even some of us at General Synod from Bill Moyers way back in 2007, that you call us now to turn over the tables and the temples of our democracy, and also the temples in the governments around the world, such as Israel with Gaza and the people there that suffer. We lift up to you someone who comes to this country from Palestine and studies to get a degree in social work, but then she is denied her diploma because she has taken on the good troublemaking image that's been planted down through our history. So we know that what you give us here is an extraordinary challenge, but we thank you for the gathering of these people here, that we can look in each other's eyes and we know that together we get it, because that gives us strength. And we need a source of strength in this time and in this place. And we thank you what each person here brings through themselves individually and also through the networks that each person is a part of. I mean, we can literally claim that even though unable to be present, the spirit of hundreds are gathered here right now. And so as we prepare to listen to Michael this morning, know that later that we can go out with the spirit of into the spirit of these hundreds of people and take on your good troublemaking character and carry it forward. You've given us a good song, a good troublemaking song. And we know now that we've heard it enough that it sings in our hearts during the week. And so we ask that you just keep on helping us to, as you sing in our hearts, because indeed we love you. We love you for what you're calling us to do. And all we do is to ask you to continue to help us, which we know that you will. What a blessing all this is. And we pray in your name. Amen. Okay. I think it's probably Michael taking over from here, probably. Yeah.
Who would like to read from Zechariah?
I can do that.
Thank you, Rick.
Zechariah 9, verses 9 and 10. The coming ruler of God's people. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth.
And who would like to read Mark? Thank you, Rick. Who would like to read Mark 4, 3 through 9?
I can do that.
Oh, thank you.
Mark 4, 3 through 9. Listen, a sawyer went out to sow, and as he sowed, some of the seeds fell on a path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seeds fell on the rocky ground where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was torched, and since it had no roots, it withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seeds fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60, 100-fold. And he said, if you have ears to hear this, then hear.
And so I guess I'll call on some people. Andrea, could you read this selection from Mark?
And 28 through 31. Peter began to say to him, look, we have left everything and followed you. Jesus said, truly, I tell you, there is no one who has left house, brothers or sisters, or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the good news, who will not receive 100-fold now in this age. Houses, brothers and sisters, mothers and children and fields with 331. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first.
Thank you. And I'll read this. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, why are you doing this? Just say this, the Lord needs it and will send it back here immediately. They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. As they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, what are you doing untying the colt? They told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. I have to acknowledge that I kind of did myself in with this particular sermon preparation. I found some very interesting and valuable perspectives, but I'm not terribly satisfied with how much I still feel like I need to research them more. But I guess it's worth something to at least discover a good approach, a good line of research. And so I guess I'm going to talk about that a bit, and then I'm going to speak to sort of more immediate concerns in our world. I've been reading a biblical scholar named William Herzog, and there's a couple books by him that are, I think, quite excellent. Jesus, Justice, and the Reign of God, A Ministry of Liberation, and Parables as Subversive Speech, Jesus as Pedagogue of the Oppressed. He takes a very interesting approach to the parables in the Bible. I think it's based on a historical fact that we often don't remember or think about, which is that Jesus' ministry was almost entirely in Galilee. And it was a ministry that was addressed to and responded to primarily by the peasant of Galilee, the peasants of Galilee. And Jesus's whatever Jesus said, his parables or whatever teachings he did, and so on, all of that was done in Aramaic, which was the language of the people in that region, and had to be translated into Greek. And also, for a considerable period of time after Jesus' ministry, the traditions about his sayings and parables and everything else were basically oral traditions. And at some point, the same people who put it into Greek were the people who, wrote it down. And they were generally had to be people, since they were able to read and write, they were scribes of one sort or another. They were actually a bit different from the people that had been the the subjects of Jesus's ministry, who were by and large peasants, and they were more educated, a bit more urban than those people. So, in looking at the Gospels, it's like looking at a archaeology site. There are different layers that correspond to different historical periods. And one of those layers is Jesus's ministry itself. And even though the act of translating the oral tradition into Greek and making it written, in very significant ways altered the tradition, because the people who were writing it and were a bit more urban and so on had different concerns and needs than the people who had been the subject of Jesus's actual ministry. There are a lot of parables that are kind of weird. And they don't really make a lot of sense sometimes. They don't appear to. And the approach that William Herzog takes is to, I'm going to take a little check here on the time. I'm going to try to remain within some kind of reasonable time framework, but I won't overdo that. But the approach that he takes is, rather than seeing the parables as kind of a theological lesson, or maybe a theological, even moral lesson, some of them describe some kind of quite nasty behavior on the part of people. And he says that what the parables were, and Jesus was a master at doing this, the parables were actually about the social reality of the time. And that was often an ugly and violent social reality. And what Jesus is doing, and this is the basic analogy that he makes, is similar to what the great educator Paulo Freire, who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, what Paulo Freire did in his work in terms of developing literacy programs for often illiterate peasants. Well, obviously they're illiterate if they're taking a literacy program. And he did this in the northeast of Brazil in the 1960s. And the method that he used, which came to be known as the method of conscientización, or conscientization is what they call it. And it's really about people who are kind of submerged in their reality, and have been treated as objects, as things, as just a part of the natural world, to be exploited like the natural world, which is the general situation of peasants. And it's about their becoming conscious of themselves as subjects with the capacity to transform the world that they're in, with an ability to grasp the contradictions and problems that they face and come up with responses to that as a community. And so what Freire would do is he would get together. He had a group of social scientists. He was a philosopher of education at the University of Recife in northeast Brazil. And he would get some of his colleagues that wanted to do this kind of work, and they would join with community members in exploring the social reality of the community and its contradictions and conflicts. And then they would find a way to represent that to the rest of the community in the literacy program. And it was presented in a way that was needed to be decoded. It wasn't obvious what the full meaning that they were presenting was, because they didn't want to just present knowledge that had already been produced to people who are then viewed as not having any knowledge. But what they wanted to do was to, in the process of learning to read and in the process of confronting the realities of their community, for them to themselves discover that reality. And therefore, not only did they learn something about the world that they're in, but they learned something about themselves and their capacity to critically analyze and decode the world that they're in, a world of oppression, because these are basically landless peasants. And, you know, part of their literacy program is going to be about the landlord that is trying to block them from occupying land so that they can survive. And the landlord who sends out death squads to kill them as a way of forcing them to abandon that land. So we're talking about people in life and death struggles. And I think that one of the geniuses of Freire's approach is that if you do this right, this kind of thing is profoundly motivating to people. And they begin to feel like that they can transform the world. And one of the ways to transform the world is through literacy, because it enables you to access all kinds of things that are otherwise closed to you in terms of understanding the world. So anyway, Herzog's basic idea is that this is what the parables are. They present a reality to be decoded by the community. And not only in the process of decoding, to stimulate conversation and discussion in the community. And I guess an obvious example would be one of the passages that we read, which is the parable of the sower. Now, Herzog, one of the things that he does, and this is why I say I don't feel that satisfied with the level of understanding that I've reached of what he's trying to say yet, because it's pretty dense and there's a lot there. And he does probably the best job I have seen of laying out what the political, economic, and social realities of the first century in Palestine were. And he has to do this because only by doing that is he going to be able to understand the parable and how it is decoded. But that's kind of a formidable task, and I'm learning a lot about that, but I need to learn more. But one of the things that he pointed out, I've never really heard other scholars talk about, but he said that the peasants had a strong belief that their relationship to the temple, being essentially clean and pure enough to be able to go to the temple and be part of the forgiveness of the sins of Israel that were mediated by the high priest in the sacrifices in the temple. that that ability to do that was very important to them, but not just in the way that we would think of at this point, a religious sense, because their religion and economics and politics were all pretty much interconnected in a way that they're not to the same degree in the present day. So he talks about the situation of the peasants, both in terms of, how the whole peasant class that existed at that time had emerged, the broader framework of that being that with the invention of the plow and the ability to begin to use domesticated animals for agriculture, a tremendous surplus began to be possible in agriculture. And from the perspective of the ruling forces, the ruling class, the question was, how do you get the peasant producers to do the work that they need to do in order for that surplus to be created? And then the second question was, how do you get a hold of that surplus from the peasants? And so one of the solutions to this problem was to create a religious system that legitimated this whole process, that gave a reason to produce more and all the work that was involved in that, and also that legitimated that being taken by the ruling elite. And the temple systems of the ancient world were central to this whole process. The temple system legitimated both what you needed to work for and who ended up taking the lion's share of the surplus. Now, in Babylonia, the idea was that the farmers, the peasants, existed and had been created for the purpose of feeding the gods, working for and feeding the gods. And guess who the gods were? Well, the gods were the aristocracy. They considered themselves to be of a fundamentally different kind of being than the peasants. And you get that the peasants were dirt people. That's essentially what Adam means, is, the kind of person of the soil, red earth. The temple system in Palestine in the first century AD was fundamentally no different in this regard than the other temple systems in the ancient world. There was a difference, and that difference was important, which is that the traditions of the prophets, of Moses and the Exodus, and of the law and the prophets that came later were supposed to be the dominant force, both in relationship to the temple and during the period when there were monarchs. Of course, that didn't always happen. In fact, we look back when David starts the process, but when Solomon is completing the building of the temple, he engages in forced labor of the people in Israel. He raises an army. He does all the things that are connected with the temple states of the time. And Israel kind of was losing its character as a distinctive kind of people. So there was a revolt by the northern tribes against this, and they separated. So the tensions and the conflicts between the various elements of the tradition and their institutions in the life of Israel were quite intense. And in the time of Jesus, it was even more intense because they were under foreign domination and occupation. And the temple, it was basically the high priest and the temple elite that kind of ruled Judea, at least, and to some extent had a lot of influence in the rest of Israel. for the Romans. So they were in deep collaboration with the occupying imperial power. They also, and this is another area where Herzog is very good, they, the temple functioned as a bank, and it was a storehouse of the wealth of the kingdom. And the it was a source for loans from the aristocracy, which kept some of their wealth in the temple. And it was the source from which they made loans to peasants with the intention of the peasants eventually having a bad harvest or other misfortunes and not being able to pay the debt, then they'd be able to seize the land of the peasants and also often had them sold off into slavery. So he really draws out the degree to which the temple was deeply involved in the oppression of the peasants in Palestine. And one of the beliefs that the peasants had was that the temple and its relationship to God gave them, there was a certain power to assure good weather and the fertility of the soil of the land. So it was an economic threat to them because as the peasants lived on the margin, they couldn't afford any kind of catastrophes in terms of drought and other things that would reduce their yield because the first one to get a hold of things was going to be the people collecting the taxes. And if there wasn't enough, then they would be the ones to starve. They would be the ones to fall into debt and lose their land. So Herzog basically sees Jesus as undercutting this whole belief about the temple and that it was God's goodness and it was God not through the temple, but God directly who was the one that assured the fertility of the land and not the temple. And in fact, that in terms of their relationship to God, they didn't have to go through the temple. And he talks about Jesus becoming he called him a broker of God's forgiveness and grace. And one that essentially gave it away for free, which that had a strong appeal. This different way of understanding things and approaching things had a strong appeal to the peasant population. And because they were always in a situation of being in arrears in respect to what they owed to the temple. And most of them, and so many of them were in debt to the temple. And so they really couldn't get access to the redemptive power of the temple. This gave them an alternative, which I guess says that when you're dealing with oppressive systems, there's nothing quite like an alternative, which is, I think that's a major problem that we have in the United States. I think it's pretty obvious to most of the population in one form or another that we live in an extremely oppressive system. But what's the alternative? The people that the Democrats put forth aren't that much better than the Republicans. Not that much. I mean, I think they're better on some things, yeah, because they belong to the part of the ruling class that thinks it's better that you provide a little something, some kind of crumbs to the peasants, and maybe you can satisfy them that way. Whereas the Republicans, their attitude is, no, just take more from them. Don't give them anything, and we'll if they complain or revolt, we'll repress them with the police. Now, obviously, that's what the Democrats do too. It's just a matter of degrees, the difference as far as I'm concerned. Now, degrees can matter, but nevertheless, to me, I don't know about you, but I feel an overwhelming lack of an alternative. Now, if there could be some kind of serious political insurrection within the Democratic Party and somebody could emerge that, actually was willing to challenge the system, that might be a different thing. But that's also something that is addressed in some of these parables, interestingly enough. I'll just point out some things in respect to the parable of the sower, because Herzog sets the scene that the peasants are kind of going, well, we're in a dilemma, we need the support of the temple for the crops to be good, but 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 we're not able to afford to pay the tax. So they're in a bind, and and that's what he sees as the context of the parable of the sower, um, where he's describing the sowing of the seeds, and that's a very important thing for a farmer, and and he describes all the ways in which the seeds are uh, essentially preyed on by birds that come and eat them, and a sun that scorches them, and thorns that choke them. Okay. And the question is, who who is this referring to in the parable? And it's referring basically to the temple and to Herod, and the Romans are the predators that come and take away the seeds. And so this is kind of posing a reality that they're confronted with and stimulating them to decode it. Herzog takes a really interesting position in respect to the trial of Jesus. He says that there were three essential allegations against Jesus. One was that he was encouraging the people not to pay the tax to the Romans. The other was that he threatened to destroy the temple. And the third one was that he was a messianic, uh, he had pretensions to be a Messiah and become king. And what Herzog says is that the first two were correct about Jesus. He was encouraging the people not to pay the tax to the Romans. And the second was also correct. He was threatening to destroy the temple in some form or another. But what was not correct was that he wanted to become king, or that he was a messianic pretender. And in the entrance to Jerusalem, now they use the term colt, but I've also heard that talked about as a burro, which I think, kind of says it better than the word colt. Um, but his triumphal entry into Jerusalem is basically on a burro, and a burro is what a peasant would ride on. If you were a great military leader, and or someone who was trying to become king or was king, you'd come in on a stallion or a war chariot. And so, if you notice in the story in Zechariah, what he describes is, he says, "See your king come to you, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." That's where a colt comes in. But what does he say that this king is going to do? Cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. So that is referring to a kind of messianic kingdom of peace and justice, and it is a humble king, not coming on a war horse or a war chariot, but on a colt. And it's quite clear that Jesus was patterning himself after that, and that's not as wanting to become king. Um, I mean, when I read that, you know, it's definitely what we need right now, is that kind of force that can bring peace to the nations. Anyway, um, so, but there is a parable that more directly addresses this question of becoming king that Jesus presents. And it's one of the parables that is one of the more difficult ones to interpret. It's just kind of like weird and hard to understand. And then often what you have is the evangelists, the scribes writing down these stories because they have a different concerns. Their concerns are more spiritualized. It's kind of interesting following some of Herzog's perspective. The spiritualization of the gospel message began with the writing down of the Gospels by people who were more spiritually more oriented towards spiritualized concerns than economic concerns. They weren't as focused on getting their daily bread as the peasantry. Not that they didn't have any awareness of them, because that still is very strong in the New Testament. But it's interesting that it does begin during that period. And so a lot of times they'll frame the parables in a way that kind of theologizes them. Um, in the parable, the unforgiving servant, um, I'll read some of this and interpret it as I go along. Um, for this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. I think a better term than slaves would be servants, because when we hear the word slave, we think of a slave in a mine or slave on a plantation. There were slaves in antiquity that had high positions. And I'm not sure that that's really the right word to use, but I don't know that. Um, when he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, the Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions and payment to be made. The first thing to note, because we don't know what the currency was worth. So when we hear 10,000 talents, we have no idea what amount of money that is actually talking about. But apparently, that is an absolute ton of money. That is an enormous sum. We do have from Josephus descriptions about, tribute um, from entire regions amounting to, like from Galilee and Perea, they had 200 talents of tribute. Or from, I think Antipas was one of the later kings, and he talks about a huge amount of tribute that was 10,000 talent. Oh yeah. No, also he was part of the 200. So a 10,000, in a way, what he's saying is he owed him, to put it into modern parlance, $1.5 trillion. Okay. I mean, he says that this is maybe this parable's a little bit like a political cartoon in that it exaggerates things, but it's a political cartoon that's like political cartoons, aiming at getting at the political reality behind it. So what Herzog says is that this is referred to as a personal debt, but it's a debt he owed it to him in the sense that one of the bureaucrats in a government collecting revenue, when they get that revenue, owes it to the government. Okay? And so this guy owes this 10,000 talents to the king because he operates according to what's called the proprietary theory of the state, which is a good term to become familiar with since it seems to be what Donald Trump thinks that the American state is, his own property. But that is the way that kings viewed it. is that the state was their property and all of the subjects were essentially their slaves. But anyway, um, so what this is about is he the king is asking for the surplus from his kingdom to be given to him. And then it says, as he could not pay, the Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions and payments to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. Now, Herzog interprets this as this, he kind of talks about these bureaucracies that the kings had. And he talks about what's called the retainers, which means the body of people that kind of constitute the state. And these bureaucracies were people who could read and write, keep accounts, bureaucrats, basically. And they were constantly vying for a higher position and for more of a cut. And they had these client-patron relationships. And that's the way society was structured at that time. And that wasn't necessarily a legal relationship. It was a relationship of trust between the patron, the patron who was the powerful person, and the client who was the subordinate. So it had a vagary to it that, I mean, we used to have legal relationships between in our bureaucracy. I don't know about anymore. But anyway, he's saying that this this servant or this bureaucrat is kind of trying to maneuver a bit in terms of wanting to withhold more of the surplus. It's not clear exactly what he's up to. But anyway, the king calls him on it and says, you're not going to withhold this for me. I'm going to throw you into prison and your whole family. And then he realizes that he's kind of overreached himself and he's trying to get too much and he's not going to succeed. In fact, it's backfired in terms of the way the king reacts. So he gets down on his knees and asks for mercy. And strangely enough, the king grants him mercy. And that'll become a little more clear as I go on a little bit. So out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, which is not a lot. And seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me and I will pay you. But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. I'll stop there. What Herzog says is that this guy has kind of lost his mojo, his standing in the bureaucracy, okay, by this attempt to grab more of the surplus that was countered by the king, and he got slammed down. And what he is attempting to do is to reestablish his credibility as a patron and as a bureaucrat by showing how he's going to raise money. He's going to raise money by being merciless with this person below him that owes him money, and I think owes tribute to be passed to him. And so he's trying to reestablish his position. And in doing so, he comes down on this other guy who's on a lower level in the bureaucracy. Then it says, when his fellow slaves or servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. So he ends up making another mistake, which is alienating his fellow lower level bureaucrats, and they go and complain to the king. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave, as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Now that's the theologizing to the core of the parable. And that's not a bad thing to do necessarily, but it's important to know that that's happening as the text changes with different people involved in creating it and developing it. Um, Now, this is where I, feel like I need to have better command of Herzog's approach, but I'll do the best I can to communicate this because this kind of blew my mind. And he's reading this in the Greek, which I'm not doing. And that makes a big difference because the translations are all based on the framework with which the translator approaches it. And I don't know if you've ever compared translations, but sometimes it's shocking how much translations are a product of the orientation of the translator. Anyway, that's why people do learn the original language because it's important. And I assume his interpretation is partly uh, enriched and guided by that. But what he says is that this king, by forgiving that debt, it's not just forgiving it to the bureaucrat and saying, "Why I don't." It's saying, I don't need that money." Meaning, I don't need that $1.5 trillion. I don't need the surplus that's being extracted as debt and taxes and so on. I don't need it. I'm going to forgive it. In other words, what's embedded in the story, this is that in parables, there's also the factor of what is called the hidden language of the oppressed, which is that especially if you're in a public, there's a distinction between how oppressed people act in public and what they'll say in public and what they say in the privacy of their own homes when nobody else is listening. And I think this is classic in respect to African American slavery in the United States, is that, I mean, there were things you said you did not say. You might be a very different person when you're dealing with the master, but when you talked with your own people, you'd say other things, right? And so the idea is the oppressed people have to hide what they're saying, especially if they're saying it in public. And that's one of the other things that makes this difficult to decode, is that it's a hidden transcript in part. And even you can see that that wouldn't necessarily be appreciated by even the people later on that in terms of that. Anyway, so here's the idea that I thought was a pretty extraordinary idea, and it comes to the core of the title of my sermon, is that this king is announcing a jubilee. He's announcing a clean slate, a general wiping out of debts, which is what Jesus talks about in Luke, where he talks about, I am here to pronounce the year of our Lord's favor. That's the pronouncement of a jubilee. So the king is announcing a jubilee, and but the machinations of the bureaucracy undermine it because that's just not what they're about. Okay. And what he's saying is that you could get a good king in there, at least initially a good king, that wanted a jubilee. But the bureaucracy, the deep state, to use that phrase, would prevent that king from doing those good things. And it is interesting because I'm just saying that Trump wants to avoid forever wars, or at least says he does. But the whole bureaucracy of the deep state doesn't make that very easy. He failed at a number of things that he was attempting to do in that regard in his first term, and he's failing to do it in this term, partly because he doesn't have the capacity to do that. Some other person in a different context maybe could. For example, the way that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to push reforms through during the Depression, during a period of crisis. But what we usually experience is that presidents like Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton got in, he was going to do a bunch of stuff in terms of that were more social welfare oriented for the population. But he basically got the message from the bureaucrats within his administration that the bondholders wouldn't like that. And therefore, he couldn't do it, including health care, universal health care. And Clinton, expletive deleted, said that the effing bond, I can't believe that my government is held captive to the effing bondholders. And this doesn't go into some sort of capitalist class behind this, because there wasn't a capitalist class in the first century in Palestine. And the major source of surplus of extorted wealth was taxation. So these are the money men in that time. And basically, they have veto power over anything being done by the king that would undermine the system of expropriating this wealth from the peasants. And so what Herzog is saying is that Jesus and many others, perhaps among the peasantry as well, saw no point in becoming king because it wasn't going to matter, wasn't going to make any difference. And I think that's a pretty interesting perspective. And I haven't read enough to really know what some of the alternatives are, because Herzog goes into some other alternatives. But I would say from the title of this one book is Parables as Subversive Speech, Jesus as Pedagogue of the Oppressed. A pedagogue is basically a teacher, but in this sense, in the sense of the pedagogy of the oppressed, that Jesus was focused on delegitimating the temple and the Roman occupier and their world. He was focused on doing that and not focused on acquiring political power that, without more fundamental structural change, would never really make a difference anyway. And that's why I put the question mark next to Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And I think that when the revolt comes, and it comes about 36 years, maybe 33 years after Jesus' death, a revolt breaks out in Palestine, and that manages to get a hold of Jerusalem and get rid of the high priests, although then I think they restore them with a new one. But one of the things that they do is they burn all the records of the debts for Palestine that were in the temple, which shows you how central that issue was. The same thing happened in San Cristobal de las Casas in southern Mexico when the Zapatistas took over San Cristobal de las Casas for a short period of time, and they went into the courthouse and burned all the debts to the peasants in Chiapas. But anyway, you see that in the occupation of Jerusalem by the revolutionaries at that time, they are mostly nationalist. They don't really change the system. It's not clear whether that was really possible or not at that point, but they don't really do that. But anyway, they also end up getting completely crushed by the Romans. So I hope that is of some value to you. We'll see.
Oh, it's awesome. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Really interesting and so great. Could you talk about how Sabbath, his challenges about Sabbath might factor in on all this too?
I'm just trying to think. Well, the Sabbath, I think that he also was challenging the law, at least the way in which the law had been interpreted, and
Yeah.
certainly a kind of the demand for a blind obedience to the law that could be exploited by the oppressors because they could have an interpretation of the law that then they expect blind obedience to when it's
Uh,
only benefiting them or it's
at the
harmful
middle
to
of
the
church service.
peasantry. And the peasantry, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean the peasants, one of the things is that the Sabbath became onerous for the peasants because you know, they needed to do things materially in order to sustain themselves. And the Pharisees were into a very rigorous observance of the Sabbath that didn't take into account the realities of the peasants and their need for flexibility in respect to that. Um, I mean, you know, the fundamental thing in respect to the Sabbath, at least to me, is the Jesus' statement that the Sabbath is made for humanity and not humanity for the Sabbath. And that's kind of his core principle, that institutions, human beings are not made for the interests of institutions, but institutions are made to serve the interests of people and to serve their basic needs. Um,
So
so
with that kind of view, that he could just as well have said, according to the way you're portraying this, he could just as well have said, the temple is made for humanity, not humanity for the temple. Or even kingship is made for, or leadership is made for the sake of humanity, not the other way around.
yeah, he did say that when he talked about don't be like the Gentiles lording it over each other. You know?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And his rejection of kingship kind of says that. But I think he actually rejects the temple as an institution. That's a little complicated because at least according to Acts, the early Christians, like James, continued to very much participate in the temple. You know, but later on that changes with Paul. So I think that's complex, um, but I think that he's taking a radical stance. That I mean, this is my own point of view on this, but to me, the Eucharist, the sharing of bread and wine in a common meal, is really a sacramentality of real life, of everyday life. That
Yeah.
every time human beings eat together, it's sacramental. And to add on the dimension of recalling the great liberations that have occurred, the Exodus, and now Jesus's Exodus from death to life, that is a part of everyday life. It's not in some religious sphere, and that the the economy, which should serve human beings rather than human beings serving it, should be a Eucharist. It should be it's sacred to preserve our lives. Everything that affirms life is sacred. And the Eucharist is a celebration of that. And I think Jesus came up with um, a religious movement, a movement that was oriented towards what they call the little tradition, which was the tradition within the villages and so on. And I think the temple is a system of social control. And I mean, when I'm reading this, when I'm reading Herzog, um, and he talks about the temple um, monopolizing the means of forgiveness and demanding that people pay their taxes to the church, uh, their obligations to the church before they can have access to the means of forgiveness by God. Now, what does that remind you of in terms of Western history? It seems to me there was something called the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages that was asking people to pay money for indulgences in order to purchase the means of forgiveness. So um, I actually think that
Okay,
Jesus
so it was
was much more
a system of
opposed to that. Yeah,
so as because it's a system of social control, maybe irredeemable system of social control, but he didn't treat the law as an irredeemable system of social control. He just said it's got to serve people, not
right.
the other way around.
Yeah, right. And maybe you may be right in that perspective that you're articulating. I would say that at least in terms of Jesus does say things about the temple being destroyed and
Yeah.
being replaced by living bodies, by the bodies united in the body of Christ. And I think that there is an atheistic element within the Christian tradition that is that is a, somewhat contrary. Um, it's in the sense that, um, and this is something that I wanted to include, uh, the perspective in the theology of liberation is distinguished from what they call orthodox theology, in that orthodox theology is primarily focused on God as the subject, whereas liberation theology is focused on the mutual recognition among human subjects, the interhuman justice in which we fully recognize the divinity with the image of the divinity that is in all of us.
Yeah.
And that what this is Hinckelamert saying this, that it's when we come together with other people in mutual recognition of their being made in the image of God, of their subjectivity, um, that God is present in that recognition. And
I love that
yeah,
because
and
then
kind of
actually
joins it and blesses it and is part of it.
in, in fact it makes theism or non-theism superfluous.
Yes, it does. That's right. I agree. I agree completely with that,
Yeah.
actually, because the focus gets put on human responsibility for how humans relate to other humans. And
Yeah.
that's the problem with religion in all its complicated, confusing forms, is when it removes human beings from the center of history and it takes away that responsibility and puts it all on God, who becomes this omnipotent, all controlling figure. That's what I call hyper God or the idol. To me, that's an idol. And atheism towards an idol is appropriate. And it may be that the only path to atheism, the only path to the true God, is through atheism to the idol and the assumption of our responsibility as human beings for each other. And it seems to me that's where he was headed, by putting love of neighbor at the core of everything and seeing God
What did you
as
call,
affirming that.
what did you just call the god in that? What was the adjective that you?
The fetish, idol,
Oh, well, I
yeah,
don't. Okay.
hyper
Yeah.
God,
Hyper God, hyper
yeah,
God.
the God that takes over everything and monopolizes power. What does that sound like? That doesn't sound like an image coming from below. That sounds like an
Oh,
image coming from above,
the word, the
above in the
word I've
social hierarchy.
the word I've been using for a few years is autonomous God, but I like hyper God a lot. The other word is just to use an article to say the God. It just demotes it.
Hmm. Yeah. And I
Exactly.
think this is a huge issue. And it's an issue like people talk about theology after Auschwitz. And now I think we're going to have to talk about theology after Gaza. And
There's a
The
whole
theology after Auschwitz and Gaza presents problems for belief in the hyper God.
Yes, for sure. There's a
Yeah.
whole department of the American Academy of Religion that is the post-Holocaust
Right.
theology.
Yeah.
And Ted and I have been to a lot of their sessions over the years, and it all applies now too
Yes, it
to
does apply
theology
now.
after
That's
Gaza.
right.
Mhm.
I'd say a missing piece in this, and this is a whole nother development, but what you see with the temple, that was just like the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was key to the fertility of the Nile and proper flooding and everything else. That was the basic technique of legitimating the exploitive structure of these ancient civilizations, was to associate the political power with the natural world and see them as absolutely essential in these things happening. And what's interesting about Jesus, he cuts that completely out. He demythologizes that. And but a perspective that Franz Hinkelhammer has is that in many ways human beings have gotten beyond the fetishization of nature, which is what this whole assertion of the temple was, a fetishization of nature, meaning you have to have the medium of forgiveness of the temple in order for your crops to work. In other words, this God, this hyper God, has to be mollified by sacrifice and by your payments to the priests in order for fertility to take place. Well, and we know now that that's not true. It has its own laws, it has its own reality, and so on. We know that in respect to nature. But what about in respect to political economy? Is there fetishism in our understanding of political economy so that we think in order to have prosperity, in order to have jobs, in order to have anything, we have to have capital and the class that goes with it because they're the job creators. You know, we couldn't create jobs without them, I guess, you know? And so you end up with people competing to be exploited by capital because they don't see any other alternative to that. And capital controls the means of their life. Without capital, they'll die. Without capital, they'll starve. Without capital, they'll freeze, etc., etc. So it becomes a kind of God that we have to placate with sacrifices, take lower wages, less benefits, attract investment to your town by giving them all kinds of subsidies and making sure that you're a non-union area, because if you got unions, then you're going to discourage business from coming there. Virginia has one of the best climates for business of any state in the country, and also one of the most anti-union orientations of the states in the country. And the same thing with the way that the third world countries are forced to do all these things, eliminate the subsidies for the poor, eliminate support for peasants, eliminate support for labor unions, all in order to attract investment so they can pay back their debt that they're never able to pay off. And all of this has to do with um, the 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 institutional loss of our subjectivity in the way that our political economy is organized. And that subjectivity is taken from us and is projected into these economic forces, commodities, money, and capital. And they reign like gods over our societies, dictating how the wealth that's produced should be used. And that is a form of idolatry. But it's a form of idolatry that people are not conscious of. And they don't realize how it's inherent in the capitalist economy unless it's going to be in a capitalist structured market. You can have other ways of structuring markets, that don't allow that to happen because you have some kind of force, the government, whatever, that intervenes in the economy to make sure that no human being is sacrificed to capital. Because that's what happens is when idols run amok, idols demand sacrifice. And that's exactly what global capitalism does. It does it both here, as it's doing right now with the austerity that's being imposed, but it does it in relationship to the poorer countries and the exploited countries. It
Well,
demands
that's
sacrifice.
the
And
child sacrifice,
yes,
especially.
exactly. Child sacrifice, exactly. And it seems to me that that's part of what is, um, I mean, Zionism uh, makes a sacrifice out of the indigenous people that live on the land that they want to seize. And it is an expression of uh, the sacrifices that were demanded of the indigenous peoples around the world by colonialism. It's essentially the same original sin as that one. And right now, I just think that, I think of it's just, and it's terrible. It's terrible that it's like there's a cross hovering over our whole life right now as the people of Gaza are being crucified.
So do you have
How
ideas
long
about,
is this going to go on? That's the terrible thing. And I know it can go on a long time
well,
because it did during the war in Vietnam lasted for 10 years.
so how to end hyper God? How?
Well, we have to make people responsible for their actions, and we have to take responsibility and for our own world. And that's the problem in the United States. I mean, people try to do that in the parts of the world that suffer the most, that are being sacrificed. They try to take responsibility, then we send our armed forces to kill them.
Mhm.
That's the reality. We have to face the depth of evil and sin that we are confronting. We have to face it. Every American has to. We have to ask ourselves, what will it take to end what's happening in Gaza
Yeah.
and what's happening all over the world? Gaza is just the worst case. That's all. And we have to ask ourselves, seriously, what would it take? Well, I think it would take dismantling the American empire. That's what it would take. And who's in the best position to do that if they were only motivated? We are. And right now, it's strange what's going on a bit. I don't know if you've been noticing it, but the use of starvation as an intentional weapon of war is bringing new people and new forces into opposition to Israel and to what they're doing because it's so inexcusable, blatantly inhuman and anti-human that it's harder and harder for people to ignore it. And so you've got um like the it was on CNN. It was Christine Anapur. I don't know if I say her name right. Uh, and she interviewed the two people from Israel, two Israelis, one of whom was one of the spokespersons for B'Tselem, which is the Israeli human rights organization. It's very famous. It's been on Democracy Now! A lot. Anyway, B'Tselem has come out along with this other organization that was also represented in the interview and said this is a genocide. And they're the first Israeli organization to do that. And that's a step. That's another step. Even this thing where the European countries and various countries are saying that they're going to recognize Palestine as a state. Even the lacking in terms of the kind of state they think that would be an adequate state. Nevertheless, that's a step. especially if they end up actually doing it. Um, it's just kind of like a nightmare, though, it to see that this has to go on so long before. But it's true that in major transitions in human history don't just happen, and they're painful, and there's huge loss that accompanies them. And, when the United States lost the war in Vietnam, that took a very long time to unfold. And, that's where I think that anybody that is, I think as many people as possible need to join in some way or another in solidarity with the Palestinians through this time. And in the belief, in the faith that there will be an end to this and there will be a world beyond this. And I think that that's what they call the faith in the new earth. And that, that the God of the Bible, the true God, is the God that supports human efforts to bring that about. And I'm in a lot of ways that section in Zechariah is kind of a description of a new earth to me. That's very interesting. Um,
And it's opposite from what you described as hyper God.
yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the thing is that it's clear that we have to have a power that is more powerful than the market, the capitalist market. We don't have to eliminate the market. The market has an important place. China has demonstrated that. And the thing is that you can criticize China, and that's easy to do because China's a different civilization than we are. We don't even understand them. We don't really have the capacity to comprehend them. I'm not sure they have the capacity to comprehend us, but but we all need to try to understand each other as best we can. And maybe China has a tradition of putting the collective interest on a higher priority than the individual. That's different from our history. Okay. Now, I think it would be wrong to say we should just be like China. The Chinese don't think we should just be like China. They explicitly say they don't think that other people should just copy what they're doing because they're doing socialism with Chinese characteristics. We have to do socialism with American characteristics. But we have to do something. We have to create a force that makes it possible to control our relationship to the political economy so that it doesn't sacrifice millions of human beings and sacrifice the earth, which is where it's headed, either through nuclear war or through climate change. We have to, if we don't want to, we shouldn't slavishly follow China, but we have to come up with our own ideas about it. We can't just go put up our hands. I mean, we can't do that. And we know it's got to be structural change. It's not going to be good just to get somebody in there and have the logic of the deep state and the bureaucracy block them from doing anything meaningful. Now, maybe if we get somebody in there and at the same time we have a vast movement that can actually put teeth into who we vote for, that would be fine. They tried that in Chile and they did it for several years, but then with the US's help, they crushed it with a military coup. Now, fortunately, we're likely, if this ever happens, to not have a foreign military coup. We probably have a domestic military coup, most likely. But if we can, we have to find a way to do that. And so we have to talk about how to create that stronger power. I like what's happening in England. Corbyn, whose movement in many ways resembled Bernie's, but it was just better because they have more class consciousness in England than we do here. Because they actually were going to nationalize the energy industries as part of their plan that the labor under Corbyn was. They were going to do serious stuff, but of course they nailed him with this anti-Semitism crap, right? Which I remember at the time I thought, I don't even believe this. They're accusing Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism. It's just absurd how absurd it was, but it worked. And it's like it's a super lie, but they get mileage out of it. They sure do. And here they are using it on us now. You know, it's incredible. Yeah. But
Michael,
anyway, he started another party. He and others are starting another party outside of the Labor Party, which I think is great. And then they had 400,000 people signed up for it. And when Corbyn started his movement within the Labor Party before, he had like 500,000 people sign up. So who knows? Who knows? So I mean, I'm open to, whatever means, but I really think people need to recognize the objective has to be structural change that creates a fundamentally different relationship between the people and the capitalist and the market. And it's the people and their representatives in the state that should shape the market in a way that serves human beings. And that, involves, I think it involves controlling the commanding heights of the economy. It involves controlling finance that should be controlled by the government. There are these various things that are prerequisites for doing that. They're prerequisites for human survival. That's what they are. And we need to get that out. We need to find ways to get it out and talk about it to people. And that includes me. I struggle with that. That's one of the reasons I do this, is it's part of that struggle. And I'll tell you, I mean, I've been working on this whole week. I'm, it's just like there's various things that are just, they're just triggers for my insanity. And this group is a trigger for my insanity.
Michael, I don't know if you saw it. It was only on social media and it was not covered by the press anywhere. But yesterday in Tel Aviv, there was massive Jewish protests against the war in Gaza and for the recognition of Palestine as its own state.
Really? I hadn't heard about the
Thousands of
second part.
protesters. It was not covered by the news anywhere. I just happened to catch it
Yeah.
through a friend reposting it on Facebook. I
I
didn't know
think we
what was
can,
going on.
yeah, I'll check that out. Thank you, Terry. I think we can make an argument that the direction Israel is headed, we need to save Israel from destroying itself.
They
That's
are
literally what
destroying
we need to do.
themselves.
Because I think what will happen if they push it with the Iranians will destroy Israel.
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen.
And then we'll get involved in that.
What's that?
Then America will get involved
Well,
in that.
quite likely.
But Trump has
Yeah.
already got ships down there.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But that will be insane to do that. I mean, basically, we need to talk to the American people about the fact that the American empire is coming to an end and that it will do worse and worse things to other peoples of the world and the environment and their own people in our country on its way down. So we need to take this into our hands. I remember back in the day of the nuclear freeze, back in the 1980s, we had a huge piece of plywood. I think it was like, instead of 8 feet, it was 12 feet long and 4 feet high or whatever. And we had one of our local artists do a painting and had all these women and children and all this kind of stuff. And the title over it was "The Future in Our Hands," to end nuclear war and end the threat, the arms race, right? And that's what it comes back down to. And the trouble is that when the gods of capital control the way that we produce and what our hands do and what the products of our hands go to, we're cut off at the root. We're cut off at the root. And somehow we've got to help people come to the realization of that. So, how did I do in terms of time? I'm sure I was really short.
Well,
I
still
actually
got
fell
one more
asleep
song
during
to
your sermon.
play. And there's really no one left to do the prayer time with.
I'm here, Terry. I fell asleep during your sermon.
Oh, that was nice.
Yeah, I did.
Well, that's good. I think getting a good rest is important.
Yeah, but it got a little
You,
boring, so I dozed off. Just woke up. I'm sorry to
yeah,
be
well,
honest.
I think describing Herzog was kind of complicated and a little bit,
Yeah.
whatever. But I think he's on the right track, though. I think he's on to something that's really valuable. But I I didn't know what to do. I almost didn't even talk about it. I almost just ditched it. But then I thought, oh, what the heck?
I
Terry,
always look forward to your sermons.
Well, you're you're a sweet person.
I'm going to play this last song if y'all will let me.
Yeah, that's fine.
This was also from the interfaith thing.